Intel's new Alder Lake CPUs have brought an onslaught of motherboards with them, including legions of expensive boards and a scourge of Z690 pricing. Today we're going to be breaking those down and looking at some of the best Z690 boards that we were able to get our hands on right now. We have a lot of boards in-house. Resident computer engineer and explosives expert Patrick Stone worked on these with us, and we have separate content on the way for AM4 boards. That's probably going to be our last round of the top AM4 boards we'll be doing before AMD's AM5 comes out. But we've got one more coming out for you. And as always, all the links in the description below, along with links to our Intel Alder Lake CPU reviews if you want to see how the CPUs themselves did just in benchmark performance. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by Be Quiet and the Silent Base 802 case. The Silent Base 802 got high accolades in our review for its high build quality and its versatility in both silence-focused and airflow-focused builds. The 802 comes with swappable mesh panels or noise-damped panels, so you have options for either approach. The Silent Base 802 case is able to fit larger builds as well without being overbearing, and it stands out for its mechanics quality and assembly quality. Learn more about Be Quiet's new case at the link in the description below. Everything obviously connects to the motherboard, so choosing a good board is important to minimizing issues you'll run into. However, it's extremely easy, especially with Z690, to overspend on a motherboard, and we want to make sure you're not blowing all the budget on a board and not leaving enough for the other components. So keep that in mind as we go through this. Z690 is absolutely and objectively and demonstrably more expensive than Z590 and 490 and everything else. So you will be spending more relative to the sort of feature set overall that you get versus previously. A couple things about this list. It's not chronological, so if you want to jump to the price point that's interesting to you, we'll have it in the time bars over here somewhere. However, a couple of important points we want to get through before you go jumping around. The first is this. This is a quick chart to show you the big picture of all the boards we're covering and to allow you to see if there's anything that immediately catches your attention. We're going to mostly cover the moderate portion of the price spectrum, and we'll throw in our take on some odds and ends like the current mini-ITX offerings. Now, a huge and very important point here too, Alder Lake is still relatively new, at least as far as benchmarking goes, and we haven't tested every single board out yet. We do have a lot of them. We have more than on the table here as well. We've got more on the way. There's a lot we're working on, we're evaluating, but we haven't looked at every single board. So this is a best of roundup, and it's based on two things. One is the on paper specs, what we're looking at when we look through the retail listings, and otherwise the price, the value, the feature set that's included to it. With a lot of motherboards, you can determine much of its quality based on the paper specs. However, there's an entire other aspect of it, which is the physical side of the board, and that includes BIOS and the execution of BIOS and how it is to work with. So that's why we have them here, to do some more work on them. So if we leave a board out that you really like, it probably just means we haven't worked with it yet, or we otherwise lack the confidence to make a judgment on it. Doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. It just didn't make our list for probably one of those two reasons. So all that said, we're going to be limiting the scope just like we do with the best cases, the best coolers, all those roundups, and focusing on getting you the fastest information for what's the right board for you and aiding in selection and it's sort of filtering out all the noise out there with the many motherboards there are. Let's start at a friendly entry price point for our tiers list, and that is going to be the best Z690 board under $150. There aren't any. They're gone. Sorry. So the first category doesn't exist. Great. It's good. We're off to a good start. It's always good to start a video on a high and not depressing point. Fortunately, we have i5 and i3 CPUs coming out at some point to look forward to, and those will bring with them B&H motherboards. And we look forward to those also being way too expensive. When they're out, though, probably something will exist at $150. Maybe it'll be 4 PCB layers and a couple slots for RAM and like a serial cable or something, but there'll be one. Moving on, this category is for the best value Z690 motherboard. We're defining value here as the highest quality of components and best feature set at the most reasonable price. Most reasonable here being the important qualifying term because it's still expensive. $220 is where we're going to start for this one. At least you get something decent though. Price creep has affected motherboards over the last few years. There was a time when this would be a $150 category, but that time's no more, so we're going to move on and just focus on what exists today. And what exists today for Z690 comes as a pair of motherboards. The MSI Pro Z690A DDR4 and the MSI Pro Z690A DDR5. The only significant difference between the two is the memory slots. DDR4 would be a more budget-conscious upgrade for existing owners of a kit of DDR4 RAM, whereas D5 would be more future-looking. Our initial testing shows the two perform similarly with our kits of memory, but DDR5 will pull ahead as it advances, so you might limit yourself there. These boards make the most sense for someone who wants to basically turn their computer on and sort of leave it there, like that, not doing much tweaking with it, because they don't really come with any useful, or not many useful, troubleshooting features. Those have all come at a premium these days, including debug displays, debug features, things of that nature. You probably shouldn't have much interest in memory overclocking, probably not too much interest in CPU overclocking. You can do it, but it will be limited in these categories. It's going to be very frustrating to troubleshoot boot failures, and those will be common with overclocking if you're especially new to it. So this is a board, again, that's sort of, you turn it on and that's it. You use the computer. Both models offer a PCIe Gen 5 x 16 slot for graphics, one CPU-connected M.2 slot for NVMe storage, and 3 more from the chipset. There's also 6 SATA ports for traditional storage. Front panel options include a single USB 3.2 Gen 2x2 header, or more concisely, USB 20 gigabits per second. There's also 2 USB 5 gigabit per second headers, and 2 USB 2.0 headers, and then audio. Rear I/O only lacks optical audio, but that's usually not a deal breaker. The boards have DP and HDMI for integrated graphics video output from the CPU. There's a legacy PS2 keyboard and mouse combo port, and 4 USB 2.0 options for peripherals. Then there's a pair of USB 3.2 10 gigabit per second Type A ports, a USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type A port, USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type C port. These are really hard to read, thanks USB-IF, and one 2.5 gigabit Ethernet for data transfer. There's also a BIOS flashback button for doing board updates without the CPU. We've actually frequently used this. This feature is useful mostly going forward. So as refreshes come out, for example, if you have the board that was bought, it's been on the shelf for a few months maybe, new CPU comes out, it's not supported natively in BIOS, you can buy the board, you put the new CPU on the side, you just flash it using BIOS flashback, put the CPU in later, and you're good to go. Whereas previously you would have needed a CPU that was compatible with the board before the refresh came out. So not a feature that you need right now today, but one that's extremely useful for troubleshooting and updating an aging system. Finally, there's 2 different types of RGB LED headers in 3 locations, and this board has enough I/O for basically everyone. There's a Wi-Fi version for $20 more. Most people in our audience, we think, probably run Ethernet, but something to consider. Either model here is good for Alder Lake CPUs out today. The VRM is a 14+1+1 setup. It has 55 amp power stage. It's not the best VRM on the list, not even close to it, but it's enough for running these CPUs stock, and it provides some less intense OC headroom, especially for something like a 12600K. The reason the MSI Pro Z690A DDR5 board is noteworthy here is simply because it's basically the cheapest entry to DDR5. It's the lowest cost entry point. It doesn't fix the DDR5 prices for the sticks themselves, so that's something to remember. DDR4 does kind of make, it's where we would push you if you're trying to save a little bit of money. Honestly, for real, that price difference, especially right now, is going to make a lot more impact on your gaming experience or your work experience or whatever you're doing spent on something else. CPU, GPU, even memory capacity might be more useful than DDR5 for most people out there, especially if you're looking at boards that are closer to the $200 price class. Now, to be fair, the Asus Prime Z690P is at the same price point with DDR5 support, but the MSI board has an extra 1 M.2 slot, 2 SATA ports, and 2 USB 2.0 ports. And so barring the BIOS, Asus doesn't have a lot of advantages here that we'd classify physically. The MSI board is using an Intel chipset for the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet as opposed to Realtek in the Asus board. However, we would give Asus a lot of credit and recognition for the better BIOS overall. These boards provide ample everything at a relatively affordable price, where relative means relative to the overpriced Z690 platform in general. The next category is for the best $150 to $200 price point motherboard featuring micro-ATX. Unfortunately, this is a de facto winner. It's the $190 Asus Prime Z690M plus D4 board. So this isn't an instance of there's just one we'd recommend in this price range. It's an instance of there's literally one. And this is the one you get. So there's one board below $200. It happens to also be the only micro-ATX board on our list. Rear I/O is what we expect from an entry-level motherboard at a much cheaper price point than this one, unfortunately. There's 2 USB 2.0 ports. You can use those for your mouse and keyboard, DisplayPort and HDMI if you use the integrated graphics processor, 4 USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A ports for additional connectivity, 1 USB 3.2 Gen 2 port, that's Type A, 1 USB Type C port for high throughput connectivity, and then there's a standard 1 gigabit Ethernet port by Intel and a 3-port audio setup. Internally, there's a Thunderbolt header, a USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type-C header, and a standard USB 3.2 Gen 1 header. The PCIe configuration offers a single PCIe Gen 5 by 16 slot for graphics from the CPU directly. Chipset PCIe provides 3 2280 M.2 slots, each using PCIe Gen 4x4, with one of them sharing lanes with the SATA ports. There are 2 PCIe by 1 slots, and there's 1 PCIe by 4 slot. The by 4 connection is housed in a full-length by 16 connector with electrical wiring limited to by 4. So it's physically a full-length 16 slot, but you only get 4 lanes out of it. Memory OC support is listed at DDR4 5333 for the official support. The VRM is a 10+1 stage design, so it's relatively simple here. There are 6 4-pin fan headers for fans and CLC pumps, 3 ARGB headers, and there's 1 Aura RGB header for lighting. That's a huge amount of fan connectivity, especially with the prevalence of fan hubs that are available in cases these days. And bonus, some of them don't catch on fire, so you could use those too. You could potentially save a little bit by running all of the fans to the board rather than a separate fan controller here, or if you want to avoid the fires, that would also do that, although you miss out on an insurance opportunity, but your house doesn't burn down, so it's a trade-off. Either way, you'll need to save a little bit after buying a Z690 board, so maybe foregoing the fan header makes sense here. For a no-frills build that runs the CPU and the memory at stock settings, this is a good place to start. Every motherboard we display after this will have similar features in slightly higher quantities, so we'll focus on accentuating the differences from here on out, rather than listing the same things from board to board. Next up is the $200 to $250 tier. This is for the Asus Prime Z690 PD4. This motherboard is a small step up from the previous entry, offering all of the same features and a few upgrades at the $220 price point instead. Rear I/O is mostly standard. On the surface of the motherboard, the additional PCIe slots change from 2x1s and 1x4 to a single by 1 and 3x4s. Once again, the by 4 slots are in full length by 16 connectors, and Asus also throws in an M.2 heatsink in the upper M.2 slot, and that wraps it up for the PCIe setup. Memory support and other onboard headers are the same, but the VRM is improved. Instead of the 10+1 on the Z690M plus D4, the Z690 PD4 bumps it up to a 14+1 design. We recommend the MSI board at this price, but if you can't get it, or if you just prefer Asus motherboards, this one works. Unfortunately, at $220, you're really not getting that much, especially not compared to previously. This board is about as barren as an olden day $120 board. It's lacking any 7-segment display, buttons on board, and it's even scarce in the fan headers. The board is so depressingly barren that even the Newegg page struggles to highlight the features. It mostly points to the RGB headers because that's flashy. It's not that the core hardware is bad, but it's a sad picture of the Z690 market where once common features at this price point are now entirely absent. The $250 to $350 price range is next. At this price and above, most of the boards will be equipped with DDR5 rather than DDR4. Our choice for this category, based on our current experience, is the Gigabyte Z690 Aorus Pro. At last, for merely the cost of an entire CPU with 8 billion transistors, you can get a debug display on the motherboard. What a deal! Fortunately, the 7-segment display is accompanied by a power button, which apparently costs $100 extra in 2021. These buttons make the board somewhat more useful for overclocking and for troubleshooting in OpenBench or as an open build. It's slightly more convenient then than the Asus ROG Strix Z690E gaming Wi-Fi. That board, in a puzzling move, chose to implement the 7-segment display, but not the power button. Shame on Asus for being cheap there. Rear I/O features 13 USB ports, DisplayPort, and 2.5 GBE for Ethernet. There isn't any HDMI on this one, but you're probably not using the IGP on a board this expensive anyway, most likely. The board does offer a few more headers than anything we've looked at thus far, as there are 8 4-pin fan or pump headers and 2 Thunderbolt headers. The PCIe slot layout on this motherboard is noteworthy for its appropriate spacing for modern 3-slot video cards. The lower PCIe slot runs at by 4 only, so a second NVIDIA GPU won't work, at least not in any form of SLI. Second, AMD GPU won't get great speeds either. It's at least open for other devices though, like capture cards. Like most Z690 boards, the CPU connected M.2 slot is nearest to the CPU, covered by a heat spreader, and then comes the CPU connected PCIe Gen 5x16 slot for PEG. But unlike most other boards, there's not another PCIe slot for several centimeters. Instead, there are 3 PCIe 4.0x4 NVMe slots underneath a large heat spreader. The Aorus Pro also has 6 SATA ports as opposed to the 4 seen on many other models, and the VRM is bulked up relative to the previous ones and uses a 16+1+2 stage design rated at 90 amps per stage, making it one of the most capable motherboards for overclocking that we've talked about yet. Barring any gigabyte BIOS gremlins, and there are many out there, this board has more than enough power to deal with current Alder Lake CPU overclocking as we understand it today, at least for anything normal. The Z690 Aorus Pro is expensive, but it's one of the better options for a heavier OC that has good onboard control, PCIe spacing, and is much more balanced in the price than the stuff that gets into the $500 range. And speaking of that price range, we've just about arrived. The MSI MPG Z690 Carbon Wi-Fi is a $400 motherboard that lands on the list for its unique PCIe Gen 5 dual by 8 capability. This is also offered by the MSI Force for $10 cheaper, so that's both boards that can run a single by 16 or 2 by 8s for your video cards if you're one of the very few people doing SLI or doing any kind of multi-GPU benchmarking like for competitive overclocking. For rear and internal I/O, it has almost everything possible, like connectivity to 3 different types of RGB LEDs. The only missing option we saw was the PS2 port. For M.2, the board provides 5 slots, 4 that are PCIe Gen 4 and 1 that's PCIe Gen 3. Running just 1 DIMM per channel allowed DDR5 memory speeds to go as high as 6666 in MSI's testing, but 1 DPC means 2 sticks maximally for that result. And also it's in MSI's testing, so we're talking sort of binned everything here. It's not something you should expect unless you really know what you're doing. The most expensive part of this board is its VRM. The VRM is well qualified for extreme overclocking, including with liquid nitrogen, with its 18+1+1 phase design utilizing 75 amp per stage components. The most offensive shortcoming here is the lack of additional quality of life features, something we're seeing as a trend now. There's a 7-segment display, but no power reset buttons. We have to believe that for $400, it's really not too much to ask for 2 small buttons. Come on, MSI. You did it on basically everything before this generation. Well, it started getting scarcer and scarcer, but please just save the insults that deep for your case manufacturing. Still, the board is a powerful one in its price class. It's just that the priorities are a little bit shuffled in some ways. The lowest cost option for 10 gigabit Ethernet comes in the Z690 version of the Aorus Master at $470. It's a steep ask for the Marvell, or formerly a Quantia, 10 gigabit Ethernet controller, but if you must have that feature and can afford the price, then the rest of the board is a solid option as well. Keep in mind that 10 gigabit Ethernet cards can be purchased separately for cheap, so don't lock on to this feature. You can buy a much cheaper board and like a $50 expansion card. So it just comes down to whether or not you need the PCIe slots and the space on the board, as opposed to just socketing in a card to deal with it. Rear I/O is the place where this motherboard makes its mark, but it made some sacrifices to do so. In addition to the 10 gigabit Ethernet port, there are 2 USB 3.2 Type-C ports. One of them is a Gen 2x2 or 20 gigabit per second port, and the other is Gen 2 for 10 gigabits per second. There's the usual clear CMOS and Q-Flash buttons for easy troubleshooting, and in order to pack all the ports and rear I/O in, the PS2, HDMI, and USB 2 ports were all eliminated. Internal I/O headers are somewhat similar to what we've already seen on the other boards. There's 5 USB headers, 10 fan or pump headers, 4 RGB LED headers, and 2 Thunderbolt headers. The PCI Express and M.2 slot setup is nearly identical to the Aorus Pro with the addition of the 5th M.2 slot below the PCH. The extra M.2 slot is connected through the chipset's PCIe Gen 3 lanes. Another place that this motherboard differentiates itself is troubleshooting and OC functionality. The VRM is OC ready with a 19+1+2 design at 105 amps per stage. DDR5 memory speeds can go up to 6400 megahertz. There are onboard voltage measurement points, 2 temperature sensor headers, a 7-segment display with an accompanying power button, and there's the 2 buttons on rear I/O already mentioned. The price is excessive, but this is one motherboard that might actually have some value to it considering all the included features. Unfortunately, it's also $170 more expensive than the Z590 version with essentially the same features. So that's the next generation premium. If you'd rather spend the entire build budget on just the motherboard, this extreme high-end category is for you. Enter the Asus ROG Z690 Maximus Apex at $720. Yes, there are more expensive Z690 boards like the Asus ROG Maximus Extreme at $1,100, but we're going the XOC everything route with this one. This should do the trick for that, at least until EVGA comes in competing with the Dark line. If you're interested in extreme overclocking and you have the financial well-being to purchase something like this, then we recommend checking the board out. But you really do have to use it for overclocking. If you don't at all, it's a massive waste of your money. We've worked with the Apex series for XOC before, and we found it to be one of the easiest to work with, especially for people who are sort of at intermediate level or a little bit better. Limiting memory to 2 slots helps get the memory closer to the socket and improve stability at high frequencies. But obviously it limits usefulness outside of these endeavors. There's an obscene amount of OC features as well, but rather than read each, we'll just put them on the screen. You can read them yourself. There's a lot. Then there's power delivery. The VRM has 24 plus 0 power stages for V-Core, with each stage rated for 105 amps. There are 2 additional stages for the secondary voltage rails. The VRM components look different as well, and if you're looking for the traditional cylindrical conductive polymer caps, you won't really be finding them here. The Apex uses SMD-SP caps, which should allow for extended VRM life while maintaining OC power levels. Other nice additions here are an M.2 drive adapter and what basically amounts to an oscilloscope, which are both separate modules but included in the packaging. The scope is honestly a pretty cool feature here. For those out there who want to build an SFF PC for portability or just for stealthiness, there are only 2 choices at the moment. Our light nod is toward the DDR5 board. That's the Asus ROG Strix Z690G Gaming at $350. It's a hefty price tag, and we'd honestly recommend just waiting on the B or the H chipsets for hopefully lower prices and better value in the future. If you need it though, we'll talk about it. The rear I/O on this little board is dense. There are BIOS flashback buttons, clear CMOS buttons, Wi-Fi antenna connectors, 5 3.5mm audio jacks with an optical audio port, DP and HDMI video outputs, a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port, 8 Type-A USB ports with different generations that we won't read, and 2 USB Type-C ports. Internally, there are 3 more USB headers, a Thunderbolt header, 4 RGB headers, and 6 4-pin fan or pump headers. It's shocking how much has been accommodated by this board size. Somehow, there are 3 PCIe slots and 3 M.2 slots in the small space. The PCIe slots are a 5.0 by 16 from the CPU, 3.0 by 1 from chipset, and 4.0 by 4 from the chipset using full-length connectors. It's specified by the manufacturer anyway as being able to OC DDR5 to 6000 megahertz. It has a 14+1 stage VRM to OC the CPU, should you desire to heat up your SFF build, and it's a lot in a small package. We're just not sure that it's $350 worth for the average SFF build. Most of that comes from the lower volume of this form factor. The last motherboard to make the cut is the MSI MEG Z690 Unify at $490. It's what we're dubbing the utility motherboard. Outside of another jacked up price, it's basically double the price of the Z590 version, there's a lot to like about this one. The motherboard has dual 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. It has expandability for up to 19 USB ports, like many of the other boards on the list. There are 8 pump and fan headers and 3 different vendor RGB header types. It can be used in dual by 8 PCIe Gen 5 configuration. Up to 5 M.2 drives can be populated. Its rated memory overclock is DDR5 6666 when using a single DIMM per channel. It has a 7-segment display for troubleshooting and overclocking, and there are power and reset buttons in the ideal locations, the bottom right corner of the board. There's also a PS2 port for OC keyboard operation. The VRM is 19+2 for 105 amp stage population, and it has dual BIOS. The only shortcoming is the lack of display output for the IGP. The motherboard has neither DP or HDMI on the rear I/O panel. You will not be using the IGP with this board. So your options here, other than buying today, would be obviously to wait. If you wait, what you can expect is B&H series motherboards. Those are the cheaper chipset options. You'll lose some of the OC support, but for anyone just sort of building a system, turning it on and using it, you will save money. Almost universally, you'll save money on it. Now, the feature set gets stripped down. Obviously, the VRM typically gets stripped down, so it's not like it's a better quality board, but the money might get allocated to things that make more sense for you if you're not going to be using those Z-class features or the K-SKU features that are out today. The next big thing is to be careful to get compatible RAM and memory slots. There aren't many generations of board that overlap with 2 memory technologies. This happens to be one of them. So make sure you get something compatible. Be prepared to wait on production delays and shipping if you're going DDR5. DDR4, there should be a ton out there. especially on the used market. So keep your eyes open. You might be able to save a little bit of money there on the used market. Alternatively, if you've got the money and you want to experience new hardware, then there's a lot of full-featured motherboards out there, and we encourage you to enjoy it. But again, as we always sort of recommend, be cautious about overspending on something you're never going to use. It's just a waste of money. You could spend on something else or get nothing at all. That's fine too. You can keep your money. That also has value, like feeling more secure. So right now, the big thing to keep in mind is set your goals on what it is you actually want to do with the board. We would advise looking at some of the high-end boards, even if you're not in the market for one, just to understand what's out there. And so then when you look at the lower-end boards, you can make a more informed decision of what is it I'm losing here? Do I actually care about it? That's something for you to answer. For most people, probably the answer is no. You don't really care about what you're losing by stepping down from an Apex at $700+ to almost literally anything else. But for people in extreme overclocking or people who are interested in the features at the high end, well, you know what they are now. So that's it for this one. We have a lot more to do with motherboards. There are lots of them. It takes a long time to test them fully and adequately. So if we didn't cover a board you like, feel free to leave a comment below asking us to look into it, and we'll try and do that. But, you know, this is what we've gotten through thus far since the Alder Lake launch. Pretty good list, and we'll keep you updated as we expand it and look at more boards, especially B&H. So that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. As always, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to help us out directly. You can grab one of our Volt mod mats for building your computer or working on projects. They are coming into stock in the next 2 weeks or so. You can place a back order now. It'll go out the door as soon as it comes in, and that's on the store. You can also go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to get some behind-the-scenes videos, especially with Patrick Stone, who wrote most of this script and did a lot of testing and research for the motherboard pieces. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.